The hospital mailed my wife's wedding ring back to me almost a year after her funeral. Their apology sounded sincere. Their paperwork looked official. There was only one problem. I watched my wife buried with that ring still resting on her hand. So, whose wedding ring had just arrived in my mailbox? If you've ever trusted your memory more than official paperwork, stay with me for a little while. For several minutes, I simply sat at the kitchen table, staring at the small velvet pouch. Margaret had worn that simple gold band every day of our 52-year marriage. She never removed it, not while raising our daughter, not through my Air Force deployments, not even during chemotherapy. The funeral director had quietly asked whether I wanted it removed before the service. I remembered answering, without hesitation, "No, it belongs with her." During 27 years serving as an Air Force medical logistics officer, I learned something that prevented more inventory failures than any computerized tracking system. When one documented item appeared where it physically could not exist, someone usually misunderstood the journey, not the object. I unfolded the hospital's apology letter again. It explained that a routine archive review had uncovered one unclaimed personal belonging incorrectly filed during hospice inventory. They expressed regret. They offered condolences. They thanked me for my patience. Everything sounded reasonable. Everything except the impossible fact sitting beside the letter. Emily stopped by that afternoon after work. She noticed the open package immediately. They finally sent it. Finally. Not unexpectedly. Just finally. I looked toward her. "You knew?" She hesitated, only briefly. "I knew the hospital was reviewing old inventory records. But not this. Technically possible, emotionally incomplete." She gently touched the velvet pouch without opening it. "Maybe it's easier just to accept the apology." Easier. Sometimes answers reopen things that have already started healing. Healing, not truth. Another carefully chosen word. I nodded quietly. "I understand." Visible relief crossed her face. She believed I had accepted the explanation. That evening I unlocked the gray metal filing cabinet in my study. Military records, insurance policies, medical paperwork, funeral documents. Near the back rested the folder labeled in Margaret's careful handwriting, "Final Arrangements." Inside lay the funeral home's personal belongings inventory. Every listed item appeared exactly as I remembered. Eyeglasses, prayer book, wedding photograph, blue cardigan. One final line stopped me. Wedding ring remained with deceased at family's request. Remained. Not transferred, not inventoried. Another carefully chosen phrase. The following morning I unfolded one of the photographs taken during the private family viewing before the funeral. Margaret's hands rested peacefully across the blanket. The wedding ring remained clearly visible. For the first time since opening the hospital package, I stopped wondering whether grief had somehow distorted my memory. Instead, I began wondering how official hospital paperwork could quietly return a wedding ring that every other document insisted had never left my wife's hand. I placed the hospital's apology letter back inside the velvet pouch without mentioning the funeral records to Emily. Some questions deserved evidence before they deserved emotion. During 27 years serving as an Air Force medical logistics officer, I learned another lesson that rarely failed. When one medical inventory contradicted another, the earlier chain of custody usually explained why. The following afternoon, Emily stopped by with groceries. She moved naturally through the kitchen, putting soup into the pantry exactly where her mother used to keep it. For a few quiet minutes, we spoke about ordinary things: her patients, the spring weather, the flowers beginning to bloom outside. Finally, she looked toward the dining table. "You've been thinking about the ring." "I have." "I'm sorry." "For what?" "For making this harder." Technically honest, emotionally incomplete. She never apologized for the hospital. She apologized for the conversation. Instead of asking another question, I simply nodded. Visible relief crossed her face. She believed I had decided to let the mystery rest. After she left, I opened the funeral home's documentation again. The chain of custody report recorded every transfer. Hospital, funeral home, viewing preparation, burial authorization. Each signature appeared complete. Each time stamp matched. Then one detail quietly stopped me. Beside Margaret's personal effects inventory, someone had written a single handwritten notation. Family keepsake discussion completed with hospice. Keepsake, not jewelry, not property. Another carefully chosen word. The following morning I visited the funeral home. Thomas Reynolds had directed Margaret's service almost a year earlier. He recognized me immediately. "I wondered if I'd see you again." "You expected this?" "I expected the hospital's letter eventually." Eventually? Not unexpectedly. He quietly retrieved Margaret's original file. Every document matched the copies I already owned. Then he opened one smaller envelope tucked inside the folder. "I almost forgot these." Inside rested several photographs taken before the private family viewing. Margaret's hands remained gently folded. Her wedding ring still rested on her finger. Undeniable. Thomas looked at the photographs before speaking. "I remember because you specifically asked us not to remove it." "I did." "And we didn't." His answer came without hesitation, not defensive, simply certain. Driving home, my confidence in my own memory quietly became confidence in the evidence. The ring had remained with Margaret after she left the hospital, at least according to every funeral document that existed. That afternoon, I opened another folder labeled Hospice Correspondence. Most of the letters came from nurses, volunteers, and friends. Near the bottom rested 3 handwritten notes from volunteer chaplain Margaret Ellis. Each ended with the same handwritten sentence: "Your promise is almost complete." Promise, not treatment, not recovery. Another carefully chosen word. For the first time since opening the hospital package, I stopped wondering whether someone had mistakenly returned the wrong wedding ring. Instead, I began wondering what promise my wife had quietly shared with the hospital chaplain during her final weeks, and why everyone seemed determined to protect it. For the next several days, I behaved exactly the way Emily expected. I stopped mentioning the wedding ring. I thanked her for checking on me. I even told her the hospital's apology had probably brought more peace than confusion. She smiled with visible relief, not because the mystery had disappeared, because she believed I had stopped chasing it. During 27 years serving as an Air Force medical logistics officer, I learned another lesson that quietly solved more problems than any audit ever could. The moment people believed you had stopped reviewing the records, they stopped protecting the missing pages. That became my strategy. On Tuesday morning, I visited the hospital chapel. Volunteer chaplain Margaret greeted me before I reached her office. I wondered how long it would take. How long? Before the ring brought you here. Not if, when. Without another word, she unlocked a small archive room beside the chapel. Shelves stretched from floor to ceiling. Volunteer journals, family support records, bereavement correspondence, hospice ministry files. Chaplain Margaret carefully removed one slim binder labeled Compassion Companion Program. Not grief counseling, not patient ministry. Companion. The wording quietly settled into my thoughts. Inside rested handwritten volunteer records covering nearly 15 years. Beside Margaret's name, one notation appeared again and again during her final month. Promise visits completed. Completed, not scheduled, not canceled. Another carefully chosen word. I looked toward Chaplain Margaret. What promise was she completing? She hesitated. The records answer that. Technically honest, emotionally unfinished. Instead of pressing further, I quietly turned another page. Folded inside rested an old photograph. Margaret sat beside another elderly woman holding both of her hands. Between them rested 2 wedding rings joined together by a narrow blue ribbon. Neither woman looked toward the camera. Both were smiling through tears. The back of the photograph carried only one handwritten sentence. No one should say goodbye alone. For the first time since the package arrived, my first conclusion quietly collapsed. The returned wedding ring had never existed only as part of our marriage. Driving home, another realization settled into my thoughts. If Margaret spent her final weeks making repeated companion visits, then whatever mattered most had always existed beyond the ring itself. That afternoon, I opened another storage box containing hospice correspondence I had never fully read. Between several sympathy cards rested a small cream-colored notebook. Not Margaret's diary, not medical notes, a volunteer companion journal. Across the inside cover, she had written only 6 words. Open after the ring comes home, not after my death, not after the funeral, after the ring comes home. For several long moments, I simply held the notebook without opening it. Then, another folded document slipped onto the table. A hospital archive authorization card. Its issue date matched every Compassion Companion visit recorded in the chapel binder. The returned wedding ring was no longer leading me toward a hospital inventory mistake. It was quietly leading me toward a compassionate promise my wife had apparently been fulfilling during her final weeks, one she never intended to remain hidden forever. I carried Margaret's companion journal home without opening it. Some promises deserve the same patience as the people who had quietly protected them. For years I believed our wedding ring represented the final physical symbol of our marriage. Now, I wasn't certain it had ever been meant to remain only ours. During 27 years serving as an Air Force medical logistics officer, I learned another lesson that quietly prevented more mistakes than any inventory checklist. The most valuable record was rarely the object itself. It was the system connecting every record around it. That evening, I spread every clue across the dining room table. The hospital apology, the returned wedding ring, the funeral documentation, the viewing photographs, the chaplain correspondence. The unopened companion journal rested quietly in the center. Every document repeated the same idea: completion, not loss. The following morning, I finally opened Margaret's journal. Inside rested only one handwritten page. No diary entries, no reflections. Only one sentence, written in her familiar blue ink. If the ring ever comes home, don't ask where it traveled. Ask whose heart it reached. I read the sentence twice, then a third time. The mystery quietly changed. The wedding ring had never been traveling through hospital inventory alone. It had been traveling through someone's life. Later that morning, Chaplain Margaret invited me back to the hospital. She wasn't waiting inside the chapel. She stood inside an unfinished wing scheduled to open in only a few days. "I think you're finally ready." Construction workers quietly finished the last details around us. Fresh paint, new family rooms, comfort spaces, soft lighting. Above the entrance hung a temporary sign: Family Care Center. She carefully opened a presentation binder resting on one of the reception desks. Inside were photographs of volunteer bedside visits spanning many years. One image immediately caught my attention. Margaret sat beside an elderly husband whose wife was receiving hospice care. Their hands rested together. Between them lay two simple wedding rings, tied with a pale blue ribbon, the same ribbon from the photograph I found inside the chaplain archives. Underneath the photograph appeared one handwritten notation: Compassion Companion Promise. Promise, not ceremony, not donation. Another carefully chosen phrase. Chaplain Margaret quietly explained that terminal patients who freely chose to participate sometimes allowed their wedding rings to comfort spouses facing the same heartbreaking goodbye. Not permanently, only until another promise had been completed. Driving home, every earlier conclusion quietly collapsed. The returned wedding ring had never been misplaced. It had quietly carried hope from one grieving family to another. That afternoon, David Monroe presented the hospital board's final preparation meeting for the Family Care Center dedication. One recommendation immediately caught my attention: Historical Companion Program not included in permanent exhibits. The quiet ministry Margaret loved would disappear beneath a perfectly reasonable modernization plan. I attended the meeting without asking a single question. David noticed me immediately. "I'm glad you came. I've had time to think. I hoped you would." He believed I had accepted the returned ring as nothing more than an old inventory mistake. Strategic surrender quietly lowered every remaining defense around him. As administrators packed away presentation folders, one thick planning binder slipped onto the floor. Several pages scattered across the conference room. I bent to help gather them. Most contained architectural plans. One carried a heading I had never seen before: Compassion Companion, Legacy Review. Across the bottom, three simple words had been stamped: Supporting authorization required. Required, not optional, not recommended. For the first time since opening the hospital package, I understood the real deadline. The Family Care Center dedication wasn't simply opening a new building. It would determine whether Margaret's final compassionate promise became part of the hospital's future, or quietly disappeared beneath one perfectly reasonable administrative decision. 5 days remained before the Family Care Center dedication. 5 days before Margaret's quiet compassion companion promise would either become a permanent part of the hospital's legacy or disappear beneath one ordinary administrative decision. I spread every document across the dining room table: the hospital apology, the returned wedding ring, the funeral records, the viewing photographs, the hospice correspondence, the companion legacy review. Every page quietly pointed toward the same conclusion. One supporting authorization still remained missing. During 27 years serving as an Air Force medical logistics officer, I learned another lesson that prevented more failed medical audits than any misplaced inventory ever could. When every document pointed toward one missing authorization, that authorization usually carried the only signature everyone still needed. The following morning, Chaplain Margaret arrived carrying a weathered blue archive box. "I've been protecting this for years." "You promised Margaret." "I promised both of you." Inside rested years of chaplain correspondence, volunteer reports, family letters, handwritten notes from husbands and wives whose final days had been gently comforted through the compassion companion visits. Then one sealed envelope immediately caught my attention. Across the front, Margaret had written, "Open only if the compassion companion promise is questioned. Not after my death. Not after the ring returns. After the promise itself is challenged." Chaplain Margaret quietly lowered her eyes. "I prayed this day would never come." Inside rested only one small archive reference card, not the missing authorization, just an archive number. Hospital Legacy File F21. Driving directly to the hospital archives, I located File F21 exactly where the catalog indicated. Its shelves contained patient support history, volunteer ministry reports, family care planning files, and hospice correspondence reaching back nearly 20 years. The divider marked F21 stood completely empty. The file had been removed, not recently, years earlier. For the first time since opening the velvet pouch, disappointment settled more heavily than curiosity. Without the supporting authorization, Margaret's compassionate promise appeared incomplete. That afternoon, I quietly attended another family care center planning meeting. David Monroe greeted me warmly. "I'm glad you came. I wanted to understand. So do all of us." He smiled toward the architectural models displayed around the conference room. "We're building something families will remember for generations." Technically honest, emotionally incomplete. Near the end of the meeting, one administrator accidentally dropped a thick planning binder onto the floor. Photographs scattered across the room. I bent to help collect them. One image immediately caught my attention. It showed Margaret sitting beside an elderly woman in hospice. Their hands rested together. Between them lay the familiar gold wedding ring tied with its pale blue ribbon. The date beneath the photograph quietly stopped me. It had been taken almost 2 years before the hospital officially documented the beginning of the Compassion Companion program. The ministry everyone believed had started through hospital administration had quietly begun through Margaret herself. Driving home, I realized the missing authorization file and the returned wedding ring belonged to the same documentary chain. They had always belonged together. Just before sunset, Emily stopped by carrying a folded presentation display she had discovered while helping organize hospital archives. I thought Mom would have wanted you to see this." The display wasn't finished. Across the bottom, Margaret had handwritten only 6 words. "Final authorization attached before dedication." Attached, not filed, not archived. Attached. The missing authorization had never been intended to remain inside Hospital Legacy File F21. It had traveled with the original Family Care Center presentation package. Somewhere before the dedication ceremony, that presentation package still had to exist. And unless I found it in time, the quiet compassion my wife poured into one simple wedding ring could disappear beneath one perfectly reasonable administrative decision. I placed the unfinished Family Care Center presentation display beside Margaret's companion journal. For the first time since the hospital returned the wedding ring, I stopped thinking about the ring itself. The real mystery had never been the gold band. It was the documentary chain connecting every grieving family Margaret had quietly comforted through it. During 27 years serving as an Air Force medical logistics officer, I learned one lesson every experienced records officer eventually accepted. One missing authorization rarely erased the truth. It simply delayed the moment when every remaining document finally confirmed it. The following morning, Chaplain Margaret called before the hospital archives opened. "I've found something." "The missing authorization?" "No." "Something even better." Within 30 minutes, I stood beside her inside the oldest archive room beneath the hospital chapel. Most employees never knew the room existed. Shelves stretched from floor to ceiling, hospice correspondence, volunteer ministry files, family support records, hospital legacy documentation spanning more than 25 years. Chaplain Margaret unlocked a narrow walnut cabinet tucked into the far corner. Across the brass plaque appeared 4 simple words: Compassion Legacy Archives. Inside rested carefully wrapped presentation binders from every major family support initiative the hospital had ever preserved. Each contained volunteer rosters, patient correspondence, planning documents, authorization forms, family testimonials, and administrative reviews. She gently lifted one tied with a faded, pale blue ribbon. Across the front, Margaret had written, "Compassion Companion Promise." My pulse quickened. It was here all along. It had to remain complete. She carefully placed the binder on a long oak table. Neither of us spoke while I untied the ribbon. Inside rested exactly what every earlier clue had quietly described: the original Compassion Companion presentation package. Not one document. An entire documentary chain. The hospital inventory records, hospice correspondence, volunteer visit logs, chaplain reports, family support files, administrative planning documents. Every record naturally confirmed the next. Nothing depended upon memory anymore. Nothing depended upon assumptions. Then I reached the page every earlier clue had quietly pointed toward: Final Compassion Companion Authorization. The authorization explained that Margaret had voluntarily entrusted her wedding ring to the Compassion Companion program during her final weeks. Whenever a husband or wife faced saying goodbye to a lifelong spouse without the comfort of their own wedding band, Margaret's ring would quietly remain beside them until that final farewell had passed. Only after every promised visit had been completed would the ring return home. The wedding ring had never been misplaced. It had been keeping promises. Track A quietly became Track B, the returned ring, the hospital inventory, the funeral documentation, the hospice correspondence, the chaplain records, the family care center planning files. Every clue now formed one complete documentary chain. Nothing relied upon opinions anymore. Nothing relied upon incomplete memories. Then Chaplain Margaret quietly handed me one final sealed envelope. The hospital board asked me to wait until today. Across the front, Margaret had written only one sentence. Open only after every promise is complete. I carefully unfolded the letter. Richard, if you are reading this, then my wedding ring has finally come home. It was never leaving you. It was simply walking beside someone else who needed hope before saying goodbye. We carried each other through 52 wonderful years. If my ring could carry another heart through one unbearable night, then our marriage kept loving people long after my hands grew still. Please let the ring return only after every promise has been fulfilled. Love always travels farther when we share it. For several long moments, I couldn't continue reading. Chaplain Margaret quietly looked toward the stained glass window.
I never wanted you to believe the hospital had betrayed Margaret. I know. We simply couldn't explain everything until every document belonged together again. Technically complete, emotionally true, that afternoon I attended the hospital's final planning meeting before the family care center dedication. David Monroe greeted me with the same confident smile. I'm glad everything finally makes sense. So am I. He believed the missing authorization had disappeared years earlier. He believed the compassion companion promise would quietly disappear with it. I thanked everyone politely, returned every document to the presentation package, and left without revealing what I had found. For the first time since opening the hospital's package, I willingly allowed everyone to believe the returned wedding ring had simply been an administrative correction. Only Margaret had understood years before. Sometimes the greatest act of love was allowing a simple wedding ring to tell its story only after every grieving heart it was meant to comfort had finally found peace. The hospital auditorium filled long before the family care center dedication officially began. Doctors quietly greeted volunteers. Former patients embraced nurses. Hospice families sat beside hospital trustees. Photographs celebrating decades of compassionate care lined the entrance hall. Everything looked exactly the way a dedication ceremony should, except for one thing. The future of Margaret's compassion companion promise still depended upon one returned wedding ring. David Monroe stood confidently beside the presentation display, reviewing the morning program. New family suites, expanded hospice services, bereavement counseling. Everything appeared professionally prepared. Everything appeared worthy of celebration, until he reached the final announcement. Beginning today, the Family Care Center will consolidate all historical support programs into one unified patient care archive. The companion program will conclude with gratitude for its years of service. Technically reasonable, emotionally incomplete, the hospital president looked across the auditorium. Before we begin the dedication, does anyone wish to speak? I quietly stood, not dramatically, not hurriedly, just calmly enough that every conversation slowly faded away. I do, David smiled politely. I thought you might.
He believed the missing authorization had disappeared years earlier. He believed no complete documentary chain still existed. I carried the weathered Compassion Companion presentation package to the front table, then removed only one document, the original Compassion Companion authorization. My wife established this promise under a continuing hospital and chaplaincy agreement. David nodded respectfully. One authorization alone doesn't establish an ongoing legacy. You're right, I smiled gently. That's why it isn't the only document. One by one, I placed every record across the table. The hospital inventory logs, the funeral documentation, the viewing photographs, hospice correspondence, volunteer visit records, chaplain journals, family testimonials, administrative planning files. Every document naturally confirmed the next. No speeches, only evidence. David offered one final objection. The supporting authorization was never archived. No, I quietly opened the final presentation folder. It wasn't archived. It remained inside the original Compassion Companion presentation package, exactly where Margaret instructed it should remain. The final Compassion Companion authorization rested before everyone inside the auditorium. Every signature remained intact. Hospital executives, volunteer chaplains, hospice directors, patient advocates, and Margaret Foster. The room became completely silent. David stared at the authorization for several long moments. I have never seen this. The hospital president answered before I could. It has always existed. It simply was never intended to be separated from the complete presentation package. Technically true, emotionally decisive. David slowly lowered his eyes. The confidence that had carried him through months of administrative planning quietly disappeared. No dramatic confession followed. None was necessary. The documentary chain had already answered every important question. The hospital legal advisor carefully reviewed every page, then compared the authorization with the inventory logs, funeral documentation, volunteer records, hospice correspondence, family testimonials, and planning files. Finally, she closed the folder. The Compassion Companion promise remains fully authorized. It will become a permanent program of the Family Care Center, exactly as Margaret Foster envisioned. Silence filled the auditorium. Then applause slowly spread throughout the room. Not for me, not for the paperwork, for one woman whose simple wedding ring had quietly comforted strangers through the darkest nights of their lives. Emily walked toward me carrying the small velvet pouch. I wanted so badly to tell you. I know, but Mom made me promise. And she was right. She gently placed the wedding ring into my hand. It no longer felt like something that had been taken away. It felt like something that had faithfully come home. Then, a hospice volunteer quietly tied the familiar pale blue ribbon around a new companion keepsake prepared for another grieving husband. For the first time since the hospital package arrived, I finally understood why Margaret's wedding ring had returned. It had never left our marriage. It had simply carried our love into the hands of families who needed it most before finding its way back to me. The morning after the Family Care Center dedication, I returned to the hospital chapel alone. Not because I was still searching for answers, because some promises deserved one quiet visit. After they had finally been understood, Chaplain Margaret Ellis met me without saying a word. Morning sunlight filtered through the stained glass windows, scattering soft colors across the polished floor. The small velvet pouch rested in my jacket pocket. For the first time in nearly a year, it no longer felt heavy. She led me into the same archive room where the Compassion Companion presentation package had waited so patiently. Instead of another binder, a small oak keepsake box rested on the table. I think Margaret wanted you to receive this only after everything else. Inside there was no jewelry, no certificates, no official recognition, only one faded photograph, one handwritten letter, and dozens of folded thank you notes tied together with a familiar pale blue ribbon. The photograph showed Margaret sitting beside several couples inside the hospice family room. Each husband quietly held his wife's hand. No one smiled for the camera. No one posed. They simply shared the same impossible goodbye. I untied the bundle of letters. One husband wrote, "Your kindness helped me hold my wife's hand without feeling alone." Another widow wrote, "The wedding ring reminded us that love does not end when life does." Near the bottom rested one sealed envelope, addressed to me. I unfolded Margaret's final letter. "Richard, if you are reading this, then our wedding ring has finally completed every promise I asked it to keep." I paused. The morning light rested gently across the simple gold band beside the letter. Then I continued reading. "Please don't remember it only as the ring I wore. Remember it as the love we shared with people who had no strength left to borrow hope from anywhere else. We spent 52 years building a marriage strong enough to comfort more than ourselves. That is the only inheritance I ever wanted to leave behind." For several long moments, I couldn't continue. Emily quietly stepped into the room and rested her hand on my shoulder. "I almost told you." "I know. But Mom said the documents had to tell the story first." She knew me better than anyone. Together we opened the oak keepsake box one last time. Inside its lid, Margaret had written only 6 words. "Love grows only after being shared." Several weeks later, the Compassion Companion promise officially became a permanent part of the Family Care Center. The wedding ring remained with our family. Its story belonged to everyone. Whenever new volunteer companions begin serving grieving families, they hear Margaret's story, not as a legend, but as a reminder that the smallest acts of compassion often become the longest-lasting legacy. If this story reminded you that the greatest promises are not the ones we keep for ourselves, but the ones we quietly fulfill for others, thank you for sharing this journey. May your kindness become someone else's strength. May your love continue healing hearts long after words fall silent. And may every promise you keep leave hope behind for generations to come.